March 1945, Japan. American bombers in the Pacific dealt the rising Sun Empire a terrible blow this month, destroying large parts of 4 major cities on the Japanese home island, killing thousands. In 5 raids, Major General Curtis LeMay's 21st Bomber Command has destroyed almost 32 square miles of Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, terrorizing the civilian populations. The Japanese' worst fears about the vulnerability of their cities have come true in the wake of 10 days of non-stop incendiary bombings. LeMay's successful campaign is another milestone in the short history of the Army Air Corps. It is perhaps the greatest victory since the nation's fledgling air branch finally flew off on its own. In Europe, American bombers fell under the control of Army commanders who used them primarily in support of ground troops. In the first half of 1944, American B-17s and B-24s spent much of their time on bombing missions designed to mislead the Germans about the site of the coming Allied invasion. After D-Day, as Allied ground forces pushed across France, bombers played a mostly subordinate role. From President Roosevelt and Congress on down, Americans opposed the concept of their planes carrying out unprovoked, promiscuous, or indiscriminate attacks against another nation's citizenry. So while the Luftwaffe and the RAF had for a time bombed each other's cities with varying degrees of success, the U.S. Army Air Corps confined itself to what it called precision bombing. Always done in daylight, precision bombing targeted the German industrial web in an effort to destroy key elements of Germany's war manufacturing capabilities. Targets were chosen for their critical products or roles, and for how hard it would be for the Germans to replace them. Unfortunately, the Americans discovered that precision bombing was not particularly effective, nor was it all that precise. The Germans always seemed to recover from the repeated bombings of their transportation, oil, and aircraft manufacturing facilities. By August 1944, the Americans began to rethink their bombing policies. Eisenhower told 8th Air Force Commander Major General Carl Spaatz that, "While I have always insisted that the U.S. strategic air forces be directed against precision targets, I am always prepared to take part in anything that gives real promise to ending the war quickly." Still, the Americans resisted British proposals for terror bombing of German civilians. Instead, they rededicated themselves to striking hard at strategic targets, especially German oil production and transportation. These attacks in the fall of 1944 were more systematic and more effective, and they began to shut down the extraordinary German war machine. In February, the Americans joined the British in bombing the German city of Dresden, killing, by some estimates, more than 100,000 civilians. Public outcry failed to persuade American leaders to back away from their new bombing policy. The attack on Dresden was perhaps a prelude to the strategic bombing of Japan. General LeMay, whose 21st Bomber Command is part of the uniquely independent 20th Air Force, answers only to the Chief of the Army Air Corps, General Henry Hap Arnold. LeMay is a veteran of the B-17 campaigns against the Germans, as well as precision strikes against Japanese factories in the Far East. LeMay's B-29 superfortresses are capable of flying longer distances and carrying heavier bomb loads, and now he has loosed them on Japanese cities built of wood and paper, targets much more vulnerable than the fortified German cities. Each time LeMay's bombers make a run on the Japanese home islands, they leave fire and devastation in their wake. Some of Japan's more important cities are reduced to smoke and ash. Now, LeMay has begun to believe that one of the founding fathers of the American Air Forces, General Billy Mitchell, was correct in his belief that wars can be won by extensive bombing of an enemy's key cities and civilian populations. With this month's raids, the Army Air Corps has proved the power of the strategic air arm. Now, for the first time, LeMay hopes, Eisenhower and his staff can see how a war, this war, might be won through bombing alone. December 1944, England. The tenor of the war is changing with each new Allied advance across the Rhineland. Perhaps just how much so is best illustrated in England, where the government has dismissed the Home Guard and relaxed blackout regulations. With the first rumblings of war, local men across England who were either too old or too young to join the military gathered spontaneously in local militias. They vowed to defend their homes from the enemy should he be bold enough to invade English soil. These local defense volunteers received official sanction in May of 1940, when then Secretary of State for War Anthony Eden announced the formation of a citizen army. At the urging of new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, this army became known as the Home Guard. Home Guard members crossed all class and occupational lines. They donned the British khaki uniform. They trained, as much as 48 hours a month, in the use of weapons they never seemed to have enough of. Often as not, they found themselves with regular Army cast-offs, or whatever they could scrounge from home. Many of their fellow countrymen questioned their credibility as soldiers. To Churchill, however, the Home Guard represented the British spirit, the determination to fight wherever necessary, on the beaches, in the fields, streets, and hills. Still, as the sanctity of British soil remained untried by German invasion, the Home Guard's job became less one of citizen soldier and more one of civil defense monitor. Their importance, however, should not be underestimated. During the terrifying days and nights when air raid sirens signaled inevitable destruction and loss of life, the Home Guard was there to scan the sky for German bombers, man anti-aircraft guns, and help rescue the wounded. They guarded bridges and coastlines, releasing countless regular soldiers to fight the enemy abroad. Often, they worked for days with no sleep at all, on duty for their country by night, toiling at regular jobs by day. Yet their resolve held. Important though it is, the dismissal of the Home Guard is probably less indicative of the progress of the war than the announcement that British officials have lessened blackout restrictions. Imposed in 1939 to prevent German bombers from having a beacon by which to identify English targets, full blackout is deemed no longer necessary. Gone are the terrifying days when German bombers filled the skies over England. Most of the airborne threat now is from unmanned rockets. Darkened streets are no defense against the randomness with which they wreak their destruction. New regulations recognize this fact and permit dim street lighting as long as it is no brighter than that of the moon. This is a relief to those who have lived for many years under the unforgiving, total darkness of the blackout. It is, one American journalist has noted, profound, terrifying, and impenetrable. Others have called it inhuman, and the complete and utter void that it has wrought on moonless nights has made many Britons loath to leave their houses. Things are different now. The approximation of moonlight will make streets friendlier and more navigable. So far, the relaxed regulations are in place, but the government has not implemented them. Britons wait anxiously for this welcome relief from what many consider to be the greatest hardship of the war. And with them wait people everywhere. For if the lights come on again in England, however dimly, it kindles hope for the day that they will again shine brightly all over the world. April 13, 1945, Buchenwald. American tanks tear through barbed wire, revealing a hell on earth. This concentration camp, like the many that dot Eastern Europe, is a monument to the hatred and depravity of Nazi ideals. All the resources and ingenuity of a modern nation have been channeled to the cause of evil. Now the world will know what rancid fruit grows in Hitler's Aryan Garden of Eden. Third Army's slicing drive through southern Germany is in effect dissecting the diseased corpse of the Third Reich. Just 1 week after liberating the death camp at Ohrdruf, General George Patton's troops plunge yet again into the foreboding nightmare of the Holocaust. Buchenwald holds the usual horrors, the walking skeletons, bone dust, and mass graves, but also illustrates the escalating haste of the SS as the Allied snare closes around them. Time has run out on their frantic efforts to move their captives and bury the evidence of their crimes. Some of the 20,000 inmates found at Buchenwald had just been moved to the camp after an arduous journey from the east. Forced to march in the dead of winter, many who started the trip never arrived. Many more died of typhus once they got there. Throughout the camp, emaciated corpses are stacked in piles like cordwood. The sad truth is Buchenwald was not even considered a death camp by the Nazis. And inmates with experience in other camps like Stutthof or Birkenau confirmed the relatively good survival rate here, where thousands upon thousands of Jews, gypsies, and other victims labored at local armament plants, forced at gunpoint to further the cause of Nazism. An average of 200 people died each day, according to the meticulously kept records in the camp's Totenbuch. While there was coal, corpses were burned. When the coal ran out, bodies were thrown in ditches and plowed over. In the final days, victims were simply left to rot in the sun. The gruesome spectacle of such camps inspires nausea even in Patton, who has shown a high tolerance for gore on the battlefield. Of course, battlefields do not produce the kind of calculated crimes in evidence at Buchenwald. Of the many outrages here, the disturbing hobby of the commandant's wife is enough to give pause to even the most callous combatant. Ilse Koch, known as the Bitch of Buchenwald, made ornaments and lampshades from human skin, preferably tattooed skin. To the soldiers, the camp was an otherworldly glimpse of suffering and despair. To the prisoners who spent months or years at the edge of the abyss, it is the prospect of freedom that is alien. Some are numb from their experiences, staring impassively at their liberators, as if the GIs were a hallucination. Others manage weak smiles or even salutes. It is soon discovered that these inmates were left behind after yet another grim exodus. There are few Jews among the survivors at Buchenwald. Those who had not been murdered were driven like cattle to Aschersleben and Schönebeck, camps further within the dwindling realm of Nazi control. Even in the face of imminent defeat, the oppressors had clung to their dream of extermination. Escape is not so easy elsewhere. To the north, where Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group has thrown the Wehrmacht into a tailspin, the SS has no time to cover its tracks. On 15 April, British tanks blast their way into the concentration camp at Belsen. The camp remains a battleground for 2 days, with British forces claiming its capture and SS guards maintaining partial control. As Allied reinforcements arrive in force, the Brits secure the camp and begin to investigate their horrible prize. Typhus has spread through the camp like wildfire, and the sick had been shut off in their barracks, left to die without even running water. Inmates who had avoided the deadly disease did not fare much better. The commandant had willfully starved some 70,000 people, all clogged into a camp designed for 10,000. Of that number, the British discover 30,000 inmates barely alive, and the dead bodies of 30,000 more. Despite desperate attempts to feed and treat the survivors, the death rate continues to soar after the camp is liberated. British soldiers burn down the disease-infested barracks of the camp. Nazi prisoners are forced to dig graves and tend to the dead. Film and radio reports of the atrocities play to outraged audiences in Britain and America. If anyone had questioned why young men were sent to fight and die on the battlefields of Europe, here is their answer. Other questions, ugly questions about the nature of humanity, defy such easy resolution. The horror of Hitler's crimes hangs like a black cloud over this great world conflict, even as the embers fade in the infamous ovens of genocide. Across the Potomac River from Washington, a curious building is taking shape. It is a building unlike any other, both in its design and intended purpose, and will likely prove one of the enduring monuments of this war. It is an enormous monolith, a 5-story Pentagon that will be home eventually to all the American military branches. Currently, more than 40,000 Army, Navy, and Army Air Force staffers are scattered about the District of Columbia in 23 different locations. Soon they will take up residence in a new shared home that overlooks both Washington and Arlington National Cemetery. While construction crews labor on its exterior, the structure of its vastly more complicated inner workings are being decided in Washington. 9 February 1942. President Roosevelt, in an attempt to coordinate the various American military branches, establishes the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Made up of representatives of the Army, Army Air Force, Navy, and Executive Branch, the Joint Chiefs are FDR's answer to Winston Churchill's call for a centralized authority to decide war policy. As 1942 dawned, that central authority was to be the Combined Chiefs of Staff, made up of representatives of the professional militaries of England and the United States. American military planners put forward their vision of an American Combined Command, which would consult with the British on all major policy matters. The Navy, which feared that the envisioned Supreme Military Commander would likely come from the more sizable Army, aggressively rejected the proposal. Roosevelt, concerned primarily that the power to set war policy stay in American hands, formulated the Joint Chiefs as a compromise. There would be a single chairman who would report directly to the president, but that chairman would be assisted by a joint Army-Navy staff, eliminating the possibility that any one branch would come to dominate defense thinking. The initial membership of what is certainly the most exclusive military club in the world is an impressive one. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall becomes chairman with direct and unfettered access to the president. Serving with him are General Hap Arnold, commander of the semi-autonomous Army Air Force, and Admiral Ernest King. A representative of the executive branch is not immediately designated, but it is widely assumed that Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, retired Admiral William Leahy, will assume that role. The newly unified American command will take up residence in the Pentagon even before construction is completed. The huge building, 5 stories tall, 1,000 feet on a side, is being built in stages that will allow occupancy of one wing, while others remain little more than foundations. The creation of the Joint Chiefs and their move into the Pentagon have implications beyond the current conflict. It is an announcement of sorts that the gutting of American power that has followed every other war in the nation's history will not follow this one. That America, as a world power, is on the scene to stay. 24 December 1942. In Algiers, the air is thick with intrigue as the French High Commissioner of North Africa, Admiral Jean Darlan, is shot dead in his outer office. After 2 years of fruitful dalliance in the Nazi camp, Darlan had only recently begun collaborating with the Allies. He was, in many ways, a man without a country, and his murder takes no one by surprise. Still, questions abound, and rumors of Byzantine plots fill the African night. The answers lie with the killer, a graduate of an American-sponsored intelligence school and a self-described French patriot. French patriotism is, these days, difficult to define. France is an occupied nation. The remains of the French Empire are administered by the Vichy regime of Marshal-Henri Pétain. It is a government of civil administrators and figureheads who operate in the shadow of their Nazi occupiers, but a government that nonetheless believes it can chart the best route to French independence. Darlan began the war as a sworn supporter of Pétain, which made him a sworn enemy of the Free French, who dismissed Pétain and his consort as enemy collaborators. But by the time Operation Torch brought the first Americans to North Africa, Darlan seemed a likely candidate for conversion to the Allied cause. So, in secret meetings prior to the invasion, he signed on with the Allies, surrendering Vichy's forces in North Africa and making possible the rapid movement of the U.S. troops through French territory and up to the German lines. Though Darlan almost certainly thought himself acting in the best interests of France, he suffered the fate of most turncoats. He was ostracized not just by his former allies, but by his new Confederates as well. The Nazis loathed him for his sudden shift, and the Allies distrusted him because there is always the danger that a man who changes sides once will change sides again. When Darlan is assassinated, French General Henri Giraud, installed by Eisenhower to keep an eye on Darlan, assumes leadership of the French North African forces without missing so much as an hors d'oeuvre. Not surprisingly, rumors abound. The idea that Darlan was killed by a lone assassin is difficult for anyone to accept. Simply stated, too many people wanted him dead. What quickly becomes clear is that the French government in North Africa has little interest in pursuing all the possibilities. Darlan is shot on Christmas Eve, and the unseen and almost anonymous assassin is tried and found guilty the next morning. Before the sun rises on the 26th, he is dead, executed by firing squad. What remains of l'affaire Darlan is sure to be one of the enduring mysteries of this war, a whodunit with the last pages torn roughly away. For now, all that is certain is that in French North Africa, the line between the sides is a bit more clearly drawn than it was only a few days ago. In the future, anyone considering crossing over will be wise to think twice.